Welcome to the Exotic Pet Collective, where we talk about tarantulas, scorpions, and all pets exotic. I'm your host, Richard. You may know me from my YouTube channel, The Tarantula Collective. And today we have a special guest that's going to be talking about isopods, inverts, and all things exotic pet related. But first, this week's episode is brought to you by thetarantulacollective.com. If you're looking for care sheets, a list of reputable tarantula and exotic pet dealers, exotic pet enclosures and supplies, discount codes, and Tarantula Collective merch, then be sure to check out thetarantulacollective.com. Find all things tarantula and exotic pet related, and stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the collective by visiting the website. And if you want to look behind the scenes and updates on everything happening, be sure to sign up for the mailing list so you can receive the collective newsletter. That's at thetarantulacollective.com. Now today we have on the show one of my go-to resources for care and husbandry for inverts like isopods, tailless whip scorpions, and more. He is an isopod breeder that has a very helpful YouTube channel that also discusses reptiles, amphibians, and other inverts. So I want to welcome to the podcast a man of many talents and a wealth of information, Russ from Aquarimax. How you doing?
Doing well. I'm excited to talk to you again. It was great having you on my channel a couple months ago, and I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Your channel is Aquarimax Pets. Now, I came across your channel. I was looking for, it was either Vingaroon or tailless whip scorpion husbandry advice, and it came up. And then I see on there you also talk about isopods, but I even saw some content on there about like snakes and frogs, and I was just wondering if maybe you could just kind of give everybody an idea as, what all do you have going on down there?
Sure, yeah. Well, I have kept a variety of pets of all kinds and bred different things. I've bred birds and different mammals and things like that. But in the past, probably, 10 or 15 years, I've focused more on things that live in aquariums and vivariums. And specifically, my channel has kind of gravitated towards invertebrates and reptiles and amphibians, a lot of that kind of stuff. So I guess I've done a lot of it, and I've sort of changed my focus a little bit in the past few years, more towards those things. But I've done a lot of different things. Worked and volunteered at a couple zoos, and just been in various aspects of animal care ever since I was a little kid.
Yeah. I knew that you did like some of the invertebrates. What I wasn't aware of was the frogs and snakes, and so it's pretty much anything that you can keep in like an aquarium.
Yeah.
Do you do anything with like tropical fish or?
Yeah. I do have tropical fish. In fact, I used to host a podcast about tropical fish, and I've bred 25 or 30 different species of tropical fish, and still keep and breed a couple different species. I probably have, we probably have 6 or 8 aquariums with fish or other aquatic organisms in them in the house. But those are outnumbered by our enclosures for inverts and reptiles now.
And when you say your wife was also involved in the podcast, is that correct?
That is correct. Yep, she was the co-host. Yeah. She did she was there almost every episode, and we did over 300 episodes.
Oh wow. So you're an old hat when it comes to podcasts. So I'm still pretty green, learning how all this works. Why'd you stop doing the podcast? Basically,
it's just a matter of time and focus, because I started getting into keeping more of the inverts and the reptiles and amphibians. Wanted to talk more about those, and had done we did the aquarium podcast for about 8 years, and after a while, the topics are not as fresh and so on. It just took a lot of time, and I was starting to invest more in my YouTube channel, and I still, do fish related videos sometimes, but the YouTube channel was kind of the direction I decided to focus in more.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially for the type of stuff we talk about. Sometimes it's better to actually be able to see what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Show people. So are the podcasts still available? Are they still online anywhere, or did you take them all down?
No, they're actually all still up. If you go to aquarimax.com, they're all there, all 300 plus. I think there's 330 something episodes.
That's very interesting. And so you've been doing YouTube for how long now?
Well, I had a channel. I think I started the channel in 2011, but I didn't do much with it for years. I would just randomly post a video like once every 6 months or something like that for years and years. But then in about 2016, I think it was, I started being a little more serious about it. And I think that's when I decided I'm going to post at least once a week. And it's grown since then. I think I had about 1,700 subscribers at the time. And now it's up to, I think, almost 37,000 now. So it's grown. Nice. Most of that growth has occurred more recently. It's been kind of picking up.
Yeah. It seems to be exponential on YouTube. Like, it takes a long time to get the first 1,000, and then, but it really starts picking up steam, it seems, and more people find the channel. And you do a lot of care and husbandry. Also, you had a series there for a while. I don't know if you're still doing it. It was, I think it was the first video I found was like, are Vingaroons or are tailless whip scorpions the best pet invert?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have quite a few videos in that series. I'm planning on doing some more, too. Yeah, the best pet invertebrate series.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed that. So what kind of got you into even talking about inverts and isopods and breeding? I mean, did you have like a business where you sell them, or is it just a love for them?
Well, it started out, honestly, that with the isopods. Well, if I really go back really far, about 35 years ago, I started an aquarium. I was like 13 or something. Started an aquarium and found some aquatic isopods in a irrigation canal near my house. Brought them home and they started breeding. And I thought, oh, this is cool.
Oh, wow.
And then later I put some newts in there or something that ate all the isopods. And then, so that was the end of that for a while. But then about 15 years ago, I lived in Hawaii, and we got a little, like a pico reef while we lived there, and went out and collected some isopods and put them in, some marine isopods. And for several years, even when I was here back on the mainland, I had marine isopods in my aquarium, and did that for, half a dozen years or so. But then more recently, we're probably about 9 years ago or so, I went to this presentation at a greenhouse, a big greenhouse that sold a lot of tropical plants, and they were showing how to make bioactive vivariums. And this was before bioactive vivariums were the thing, This was just when they were starting to get popular. I mean, dart frog breeders were keeping them like that, but hardly anybody else in other aspects of the hobby were keeping them. And so I remember watching this presentation being absolutely amazed, and just the hair in the back of my neck was sticking up. I was like, this is game changing. This is going to be awesome. And so I've got to get some isopods. So I started researching it, and mostly on dart frog websites at the time, because that's the only place you found anything about isopods. Oh, and interestingly enough, hermit crab keepers were starting to use isopods at about that same time for their bioactive setups. And so I did all the research I could, found a local dart frog breeder, and I got some Porcelio scaber orange, some dwarf whites, some Costa Rican purples, and got started. And that was probably about 8 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, I've just recently started keeping some isopods, and essentially it came through, I set up some bioactives. People suggested like some tiny dwarf isopods, and by trying to find a source for those, I discovered all of the different species that are out there and different genuses. And one thing that I've having a hard time kind of figuring out, like the husbandry for isopods, it's not all the same. It's not like across the board you just do this. Like there's other there's like just how different, can't talk. The difference in between them. I mean, there are like arid species and tropical species, or can you give me some insight into like how do they break that down or separate them?
Sure. Basically, there are a lot of different factors that vary between different isopods. In general, most keepers try to arrange the enclosure itself so that there's a humidity and moisture gradient on the substrate itself, so that the isopods can choose where they're going to be. And some will spend almost all their time on the dry side. Some will spend it on the moist side, where they'll have like a little pile of sphagnum moss they keep moist there, because some of them, like the clown isopods, Armadillidium klugi Montenegro, for example, is one form of that species. And if you keep them too wet, they'll just die. And, dwarf white isopods that people use for a lot of bioactive setups, they're fine if it's moist all the time. They do not care, because they're a more tropical one coming from like rainforest areas, and it can be moist all the time. They're totally fine. But if you provide that gradient, then almost all species will find a spot in the enclosure where they do fine. So there's that. That's one aspect. The actual moisture in the substrate itself, and some can handle a lot, some need a dry area. Then there's ventilation. There's some that like it moist but need a high ventilation. There's some that like it, that gradient and need high ventilation. And there's some that really don't need much ventilation at all, very little. And so ventilation is another area where that is kind of an important difference. And then there's feeding too. Some will spend a lot of time, or a lot of their food they'll get from eating basically leaf litter that's decomposing. And others prefer more protein-rich sources of food. And almost all of them will eat both, but the proportions vary. So, and I used to think, and I think to a large extent this is true, but not entirely, that there's some groups like Armadillidium, for example, the genus Armadillidium, the genus Porcellio, both have a lot of species that like a lot of ventilation. And so they also need that moisture gradient where they can regulate their own moisture needs. But there are some species in both of those genera that don't need it. They don't need a high moisture gradient. They can stay all moist and they don't need a lot of ventilation. So you can't really generalize and say all Armadillidium are this way or all Porcellio are this way. But there are certain in those groups that do need it. And so it's more on a species by species basis. You just say, okay, what does this one need?
I gotcha.
Like Armadillidium vulgare, the common pill bug, and there are a lot of color morphs and whatnot, they tend to do better with a little ventilation, with some good ventilation. Armadillidium nasatum, very closely related, they can get by with much less.
Okay.
So you just...
Now, are any isopods, can you use any type of isopods in a bioactive enclosure for like reptiles, or are there specific like genus or species that tend to work better?
There are certain species that work better for different setups. You just look at the ventilation, look at the moisture, also the temperature, like you were mentioning before. There are some that do better at warmer temperatures, some that can't stand cooler temperatures. So we need to think about that. And then there are also some that tend to be a lot more voracious in terms of protein requirements. And so this is still a matter of debate. It's pretty much a controversy in bioactive setups and with keeping isopods, which species you can keep with reptiles and amphibians safely, and which reptiles and amphibians you can keep them with. For example, Porcellio laevis tends to like a lot of protein. And some people say, oh, never put those in a bioactive enclosure because they'll eat your whatever, eat your gecko or eat your tarantula or whatever it is. And then other people say, oh yeah, I use them all the time. And there's never a problem. And so there's some suspicion that, if a reptile dies, of course they're going to go after it. If your invert dies, of course they're going to go after it. That's what they're there for, to eat dead organic matter. And so some people, in many of these cases, it might be anecdotal evidence, and where people are just saying, well, one day my lizard looked fine, and the next day I looked in there and my lizard was dead and my isopods had eaten half of it. So it must have been the isopods must have killed it. But, in many of these cases, it's just that it died and then they ate it. So
yeah, I've heard that a lot. At least in the tarantula and scorpion hobby, people that have been keeping, especially tarantulas, like that's the bioactive enclosures, like the new hot thing at the moment. It seems like even species that don't really need or would benefit from a bioactive enclosure, people are like, oh, they look cool, I want to put this arid species in a bioactive enclosure or something. But that's like I don't know if it's an old wives' tale or a new wives' tale. I don't know if that's a thing, but it's like the new thing that's kind of sweeping across the invert hobby is that isopods are dangerous for tarantulas, because especially with the tarantulas molting, that the isopods will just start feeding on it. But then that, like you said, it's kind of controversial, because as many people that have said I have had this happen to me, there's as many, if not more, people that say, well, I keep isopods in the enclosure and I've never had a problem.
Right.
So has there been any instances that you know of where an isopod would attack a living animal, or do they only go after dead animals?
Well, I've heard a couple of things. I've heard that beetle pupae, for example, if you were breeding beetles and you try to keep isopods with beetle pupae, they will eat them. That's from a respected invertebrate author, Oren McMonigal, said that straight out, that has happened. But in his experience, his extensive experience, I think that's the only one he's ever mentioned. I have never had a problem with isopods eating any of my pets, in a bioactive setup, but I have also not tried tried everything. So,
Yeah.
I have, for example, kept Porcelio laevis, dairy cow, isopods in with a crested gecko. And some people say, oh, don't do that. I've been doing it for a long time. They do the greatest job at keeping that vivarium clean. The gecko's fine. Haven't had any problems at all with that. And it seems great. But that doesn't mean I can say, well, I've done it, so it works, because maybe someone else has a different experience.
So what are the benefits of keeping isopods in a bioactive enclosure like that?
There are quite a few. One is that, and I think this is maybe the one that most people find most attractive initially, and it's a very helpful component. They will eat poop. They will just eat it. So if you have lizards, frogs, whatever it is, or invertebrate frass that they're producing, they will eat it. And getting rid of that and not having to clean it up as much is nice. Now, that doesn't mean you'll never have to clean it up, because, for example, I keep crested geckos, and they don't care where they poop, and they will poop on the glass sometimes, and the isopods can't reach it, so you have to wipe it off. Sometimes it'll land on a piece of decor in a place where it's too dry or just too inaccessible for the isopods, and they won't get to it. So you still have to spot clean. And then reptiles will produce urates as well, like the white part of the poop, and you have to clean that up, because isopods generally won't eat that. But that's a big one. I mean, they take care of it fast enough in a nice, healthy, mature bioactive enclosure that you don't have to worry about smelling it or seeing it in most cases, except in the exceptions that I noted. Or if they go in their water dish or something like that, obviously you want to clean that up. But that's one. And they will also take care of sheds, and that's in reference to invertebrates as well as reptiles. If your lizard or a lot of lizards will eat their sheds, but they'll miss pieces. The isopods will clean it up. With snakes just leave their entire skin there, of course, and the isopods will eat that. Within hours often, they'll take care of most of it. I mean, they're fast. Inverts, like my tailless whip scorpions, I can leave the molt in there and not have to worry about it getting all moldy, because isopods will eat it. So there's that. They will also eat dead plant material. So if you've got plant leaves that are falling down and dying, the isopods will eat that. But another really important aspect is that, of course, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you have a beautifully planted enclosure with substrates and you don't have isopods and springtails in it, you're going to get something living there to take their place. And it's going to be fungus gnats or phorid flies or mites or, all three, things like that. But if you preemptively put the isopods and springtails in there, they're going to greatly reduce the amount of those other things that come in there. And once they reach a nice, healthy, mature population, they're basically going to crowd them out, outcompete all those other more pestiferous arthropods that we don't want in there.
Yeah. Now, can you do just isopods or just springtails, or do they work better as like a combination?
I think they work best in a combination, partly because one of the reasons we want to control the organic material in there is to control fungal growth, especially mold, right? And springtails are kind of a specialist on eating mold itself, whereas isopods will more eat the things that the mold would grow on and not give it a chance. So by using both, you're sort of covering your bases. There are also places that isopods can't reach as effectively that springtails can. And springtails are great, but they're also really small, and so they just can't handle the sheer volume that isopods can. So they're beneficial. It's beneficial to keep both. And I, in fact, keep springtails with most of my isopods, and I think a lot of isopod keepers do, just for that reason, because springtails make a good cleanup crew for the isopods, and the isopods and the springtails make a good cleanup crew for everything else.
Okay. Now, this is something I've been wondering for a while. Like I've only been doing bioactives I think I started my first one maybe about a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. But I've got like a ball python in a bioactive enclosure, a milk snake, some tarantulas, one of my scorpion communals is bioactive. And the issue that I've, especially when it comes to like the tarantulas more than anything, you don't have to change the substrate out and clean it out as often, but occasionally you do, especially like with the geckos. Like, I mean, they make a mess sometimes. And how do you save the isopods or springtails that are in that current communal? I mean, do you just throw it all out, or is there some way of transferring some of the healthy parts of that bioactive into a new bioactive? Yeah.
And it totally depends on the kind of substrate you're using, because with, like a fully tropical or subtropical bioactive setup with a drainage layer, which you'll use with dart frogs and with quite a number of other species, where you're trying to make sure that there's this layer of porous material like hydroton or whatever that make sure that the humidity of the enclosure that is kind of constant to some degree, and that there's also water available for the plant roots. If that's the kind of bioactive setup you're going to, replacing that substrate is both more expensive and a little bit more involved than it is if you just have, say, something like cocoa fiber and some leaf litter and an inch or so of that. And they're both totally different situations, really. But if you're going the full multi-layer substrate bioactive route, then I would recommend taking some of that substrate and just sprinkling on top of the layers of your new substrate when you replace it, because you're going to have some of those isopods and springtails in there. And then that will help. If you have the other type of substrate where it's just like cocoa fiber or something similar to that, and you're keeping isopods in there, then you can throw some food in there for a couple of days and then scoop up whatever isopods, congregate around the food and springtails and whatnot, and then do the same thing, just reseed it and add some of that original substrate back in, because there seems to be a microbial population in both cases, no matter which kind of bioactive substrate you have, in that substrate that if you don't include some of that, and moving on to the next one, you're going to have kind of a cycling where it's going to get moldy or different things like that will happen. And if you include some of that older substrate, it'll help mitigate that some.
Very interesting. I didn't even think about that microbial aspect of the substrate.
Yeah.
Now, do they self-regulate their population, or do you have to worry about, just an explosion of isopods in the enclosure that you have to thin out?
It depends on several factors, once again. On the species you're using, that can be an important aspect there, because certain species they're really, really prolific, especially at certain temperatures. Like the dwarf whites are really prolific if the substrate is moist and we have, a fairly warm temperature. So if you're looking at, say, 80 degrees, 82 degrees, something like that, they will really, really breed like crazy. Of course, they're really small, and so it may not be a problem for them to be a lot of them, as long as they're in balance with the kind of nutrients that are going in there. And that's a big part of it too. I mean, what are they getting food-wise? If they're not getting a lot of food, they're not going to overpopulate the enclosure, generally. If they're getting lots and lots of food, they're going to reproduce a lot. So you can regulate it to some degree that way, based on how much food is going in there. A lot of isopods, not all, but a lot of isopods breed much, much better if they're getting leaf litter as a constant in their enclosure. And so if you have that, and then they're also getting supplemental food in the form of shed skins or leftover food from the macro inhabitant in your vivarium or whatever.
Yeah.
If they're getting enough of that, they might really kind of overpopulate. But if you think, oh, well, all I have to do is reduce the leaf litter that I add in here, and then they're not going to reproduce as much. That does work for some species.
Okay. And as far as like springtails are concerned, are there different species of springtails that are used in the hobby, or are they pretty much just all the same?
Well, there are quite a few, and some are much more tolerant of humidity fluctuations. Some require really, really high humidity all the time, basically like dart frog level humidity, or they don't do very well. And some can handle a lot more ventilation, so you can use them in a semi-arid enclosure. Like I have springtails living in my Leopard Gecko enclosure, and they do great. I feel like they're not as, it's not quite as heavily populated by the springtails as some of my other enclosures, because they have to stay right up against the substrate under the leaf litter most of the time, because they just dry out if they were out in this well-ventilated, warm enclosure. But there are several species. The species known as the giant springtail is one of the real useful ones. And Sinella curviceta is another one. I'm not sure it has a common name, but I use that one a lot, and it's good in well-ventilated enclosures. And then I like to use Fulsomia candida, which is one that likes really high humidity, but for high humidity enclosures, it's great. So those two are my go-tos right there. I do have some other species that just kind of have shown up, smaller ones, but those two are big enough to do a good job, and they're readily available in the hobby.
So you said you started, you learned about different bioactive enclosures from a presentation, and mainly at the time it was just dart frogs. From your experience, from where you are, what species are you seeing bioactive enclosures starting to spread to? Like I've seen people with geckos and snakes, tarantulas is starting to kind of catch on. Are there other exotic pets out there that seem to benefit from a bioactive setup?
Well, there's been a real explosion with reptiles and amphibians of all kinds, beyond geckos and snakes as well. I mean, I've had people buy isopods for me they want to try with their tortoise. I've had, let's see, just about any kind of lizard or any reptile, as well as other invertebrates too. People keep their mantis in a bioactive enclosure these days, or they want to try it with other kinds of spiders beyond tarantulas as well, just all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I think I've even talked to a couple of people who want to try it with mammals. And I think that's a little bit more difficult for several reasons, partly because of the ammonia that mammals excrete in their urine, partly because their metabolisms are so much higher and they're producing huge volumes of waste compared to a reptile's waste. And other reasons too. I think there are a lot of reasons why that may not be as practical, but the interest is there, at least, in expanding it to every possible place that it could be used.
Yeah. This is a question I get a lot, especially in the Facebook group. When people are talking about setting up bioactives, especially for like tarantulas or scorpions, they're wondering if like the isopods, especially the large adult ones, could also be a food source for different invertebrates. I mean, I guess, can you feed isopods to tarantulas? Will they eat them, or will they just kind of like cohabitate and not really bother each other?
I think that depends a lot on both the species of isopod and probably the tarantula, the size of tarantula, the size of isopod. Like dwarf white isopods don't seem particularly interesting probably to most adult tarantulas. But I've heard of people feeding slings, small dwarf isopods. I've heard it happening. I mean, for a lot of invertebrates, isopods are not particularly attractive as a food because it depends on the isopod. And I don't want to generalize too much because there are some isopods that are really active and about on the surface. A surface active, fairly large isopod might be really interesting as a food item for some tarantulas, for example. And then one of the more fossorial species of isopod that, never is out during the daytime may not be, except for maybe a fossorial tarantula sling might be interested. I don't know. But as far as being a food item in general, there are some species that, in the dart frog hive, for example, the dwarf whites were widely regarded as a supplemental food source as well as a cleanup crew. I mean, that was always part of the deal. And that's the same with some of the larger isopods because dart frogs are specialist feeders that will only feed on very small food items in relation to the frog's body size. Most dart frog species are that way. And so people would put larger isopods in with them knowing that, okay, I'm going to put an adult population in there and they're going to breed and the frogs are going to eat some of the babies, and that's fine because they can't eat the adults. And so they'll be they'll maintain a population in there. And that's probably true with some other creatures. I've played a little bit with isopods as food items for other things. I tried feeding isopods to tailless whip scorpion, for example, wasn't interested. Tried it with a jumping spider. Jumping spider did catch and envenomate an isopod and played with it for a minute and then dropped it. Wasn't too interested. But I've heard other people with other jumping spiders where they do eat them. So it might be more of a preference for that individual.
Yeah.
So other people have said like mantis might eat. Some of them seem to actively hunt out isopods and they'll eat them right off the substrate, and others will pick them up occasionally and then drop them because they're too, their shell is too hard and they're not that interested. So I think it varies a lot on which species you're working with from both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. I have one of the my Theraphosa sturmi, it's a Goliath bird eater tarantula, is in a bioactive, and I have seen like the isopods walk right in front of it, and I know that it's hunting crickets, so it's kind of like even in that mindset of movement as prey.
Yeah.
But it completely ignores any isopod. Like it's like they're not even there, and so I didn't know if maybe they secreted some kind of chemical or something that they like. I know mealworms, like my tarantulas will eat mealworms, but they won't eat the beetles they grow into.
Oh
yeah, they're too hard or they smell bad or taste bad or what it is, but they have no interest in them. So I saw that same behavior with isopods, so I kind of figured they probably wouldn't make a great food source, but I didn't know if other species of inverts would eat them. Now, one thing I've thought was kind of interesting, like I always saw isopods as just like springtails, like they're just an invert, that you just throw into a bioactive to kind of keep things clean. But it seems like there's like this whole genre of the invert hobby that's just people keeping isopods as pets. And I think that's something like, do you keep them as pets, or like, kind of like how I keep a lot of tarantulas? Do you keep a lot of different species of isopods, or do you just keep them and breed them for bioactive reasons?
I do both. It was probably about 2013 when there started to be not just, a change in mindset is when it started from isopods are purely functional, are very nearly purely functional in bioactive area to, oh, these are cool and I want to keep them for their own sake. Somewhere around there is when it started, and I do both. I mean, I do sell isopods. A lot of them go to bioactive setups. And so I make sure I keep the staples for bioactive setups like dwarf whites and the powder blues and, species like that where people are going to use them in situations like that. But I also keep a lot of, color variants, and that there are both very colorful natural types of isopods where the wild type is extremely colorful, like the clown isopod or Armadilly gestroy, or where they have a really cool pattern like the zebra isopods, or have a really cute pattern, I guess you'd say, like the rubber duckies, where they look like they have the face of a little rubber ducky. So I have a lot of those as well. And they definitely, I'd probably make more money from the hobby isopods. I'd have to check to make sure, because I do sell a lot of the bioactive ones. But the hobby isopods are pretty popular, and they're just growing. It's growing exponentially. And when you asked about the, whether isopods secreted some kind of defensive fluid. I know that when you were talking about like the mealworm beetles are distasteful, well, they'll eat the larvae. Yeah. Same with superworms. The beetles secrete that nasty smell, and the larvae are perfectly fine to eat. Isopods, interestingly enough, as far as we know, there aren't any that produce, at least not in the terrestrial isopod groups that we have, that produce any sort of defensive chemical or anything like that. There are a couple that will produce kind of a sticky fluid when they're attacked or bothered, but as far as a chemical that is harmful in and of itself, it doesn't seem that there are any, but there are several. The most colorful of them are thought to mimic other colorful creatures. Basically, it's a form of Batesian mimicry where they look like something that tastes bad, like the clown isopod has the red skirt and the white and yellow spots, is thought to mimic a spider that's related to the black widow that comes from that area in the Mediterranean.
Interesting.
And Armadilly gestroy and the zebra pillbug too, Armadilly Immaculatum, are thought to mimic pill millipedes that do have chemical secretions that are distasteful.
I see. Now, are there species of isopods that you said you sell, like you breed and sell them, I'm assuming on your website?
Yeah.
Which I got scrolling across the bottom there for anybody that's interested. Some of them you sell specifically for bioactive enclosures. Some you said are hobby. Are there species that you suggest people don't use in bioactive enclosures, and like they're a species just to be kind of kept separately?
Yes, there are quite a few of those. One that I would say, most of the Cubaris species probably have some potential, like the rubber ducky is one of them. They tend to be very colorful pill bugs, but I wouldn't use any of them in a bioactive enclosure just because they're so expensive. So if they were to get eaten, you don't want a $20 isopod to be eaten by your frog or whatever.
Wow. Yeah.
And then there are those. There are also some others, like the giant species. The largest species in the hobby are, for some reason, Spain seems to be, and in a few areas around Spain, there's some in Greece and different places like that, but Spain seems to be really the hotbed of these giant Porcellio species that are really long. Some of them have really nice patterns or colors, but they're the biggest fully terrestrial isopods in the hobby, basically. And you might actually be able to put them in some sort of semi-arid enclosure as long as they had a moisture gradient, but they need a lot of ventilation, most of them. And if you were going to put them with a lizard or something, they're big enough to look like a food item. And so I really don't recommend people use most of the giant Spanish Porcellio species as a bioactive component.
So what makes species like the rubber duckies so expensive? Are they hard to breed? Are they just rare in general, endangered? Like, what's the story there?
Well, I think there are several things at play here. One is that they're coming from a lot of them are coming from Asia. Most of the Cubaris species that are in the hobby now are coming from Asia, and they're still discovering new ones fairly frequently. And there's some of them seem to be coming from cave systems that are probably really restricted in range. Their natural range is probably really restricted. And there's some question about how ethical it is for them to be coming into the hobby that way. I mean, how are they being collected? That kind of thing. Is this sustainable? All that stuff. So that's going on. And so while that's going on, people are really trying to captive breed them, as they should. We want to get captive breeding populations going. And many of the Cubaris are not that difficult to breed, but they're very, very sought after. So demand is just incredibly high. And of course, while demand's incredibly high, anybody who's selling them is going to keep that price point as high as they can. And there are, for me, with rubber duckies, I started trying to keep rubber duckies some time ago. I would have to go look back at my records and see how long, but over a year, certainly, when I first got them. And they did not breed for me at first. And I was pretty puzzled because, most isopods, it's just, you get the setup and you put them in and bang, you're going to have babies. It's just the thing. That's how it works. And I was having trouble with breeding them. They weren't dying off or anything for a long time. They were just not breeding. And I was puzzled by that. And then finally, all of a sudden I started getting die off. And I thought, whoa, I have this population. I've had it for a long time. It's been stable. What's going on? Why are they dying off? And I lost a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them. And so I got a couple more to try to bolster my numbers. And then just, it wasn't that long ago. It was probably just a couple of months ago. I started noticing babies everywhere, baby rubber duckies, and then another batch. And, now they're breeding for me really well, but they weren't at first. And to someone who's, had like 25, 30 species or different types of isopods, whatever, before that, and they were all breeding, pretty much most of them were breeding just fine. I was wondering what was going on, and I'm not the only one to have had that experience.
Yeah. I noticed some of the isopods I was keeping, like in their own enclosure. I can't think of the species right now, but I had them, someone sent them to me, and I had them for probably 6 months. And then they had told me they were like prolific breeders, like they were going to be breeding. And I didn't see any breeding going on. Like, and I was like, what is going on? And I started, and I think that's one of the videos of yours I watched, like how you were keeping them. And I wasn't providing enough ventilation for that species. So I drilled in some more holes, kind of changed, like I just kind of had some moss on one side I was keeping wet and let the other side dry. And then like within months, there's, the population started exploding. So it seemed like the husbandry really affects, at least from my experience, how quick they breed or if they breed. Is that something you've noticed?
Yes, definitely. And providing that gradient like you did in the extra ventilation, I'm sure that was it. That really seems to get most isopods going, because basically they love to find their microhabitat and stay in that area much of the time. And if you're providing that gradient, they can find the perfect spot for whatever it is. Because when they're molting, they probably want it a little more humid, and there's different things they need to do. So that's the way to do it. It would be interesting to see which species that was, but yeah, that generally tends to do it. And when I switched, I wasn't always doing that. I think I've always done the ventilation thing, where I've been sensitive to trying to provide ventilation for whatever species I'm working with that's appropriate. But I didn't always do the moss, on one side as the hydration station, so to speak. And I think it was Wally at Supreme Gecko was talking about he was doing that. And I thought, oh, I need to do that too. And as soon as I did, I felt like the species that were doing okay but not as well, now doing better. Ever since I did that. So I've been doing it for quite a while now, and it works great.
Yeah, it was the species, you actually mentioned them earlier. I can't think of the scientific name, but they're very large gray, like they were like giant isopods.
Was it Porcelia Hoffmannsegei, the Titans?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
I could grab them, but it's a podcast. Nobody could see them. But yeah, it was, and I could look it up. I'm sure I have it on my phone in my records. But you had mentioned, I don't know if it was in our live stream or if we did on your channel, or if it was, I looked up the video, but I saw that, that you suggested they needed higher ventilation and that kind of gradient, with moisture. And now I've got babies all over the enclosure. I actually had to move them into a larger enclosure because I was like, there's not enough room in here for all of them.
Yeah.
They get big. I don't mean to like just stick on this isopod because you have experience on so many other types of animals, but you were discussing essentially like there some of those I forgot the name of it, the rubber duckies. Those are the ones that you were referring to are coming from like cave systems.
Well, they may be. They seem to like limestone and things like that. So at least some of that genus are coming from cave systems. Yeah.
So are there like any legal restrictions on importing or selling different species of isopods in the States or like in other countries?
Yes. Yes. And there are, it's kind of a controversial topic, honestly. but yes, there are, and there haven't always been. It's been a fairly recent thing where restrictions as far as permits goes. Isopods were kind of under the radar for a long time because very few species were kept, and the species that were kept were extremely widespread and had been for a long time. But once people started importing isopods from all over the world, then the aphids started to take notice and they said, okay, well, we need to start looking into this. And some people, it seemed to do okay without worrying about the regulation, and other people think it's really important to get the permits. And I'm not here to judge, how that goes down. I personally have permits to ship to all states but Hawaii and Florida, and I'm working on Florida right now. They have kind of tighter restrictions because it's a place where a lot of things could get established potentially because a lot of things already have. So yeah. I'm working on that, but I can ship to all of the states besides Hawaii and Florida, but I can't ship all the species I keep. There are some species I'm cleared to keep, but not to ship out of state, things like that. So, and then there are some states that have restrictions, like Louisiana and Oregon. I can only ship certain species to, and then all the rest of, Louisiana, Oregon, and Florida, I think are the ones that are going to have restrictions on which species I can ship, and then all the rest just follow the normal, the approved list that I have. So, yeah, there are, and when I ship out, I have to send a little sheet that says from that APHIS, that's the Plant Health and Inspection Station for the country. Basically, they produce this sheet, and I have to send that out with my shipment that says, this is how you have to treat these isopods that you've gotten shipped from, that kind of thing. And I have to ship a permit number with it and everything.
Now, the regulations and the permit and all that kind of stuff, is that based on the fear that they will become an invasive species in the area they're being shipped to? Or does it have to do with where they are endemic or native and like illegally exported initially or something?
I think all of that plays in. With a lot of the isopods in the U.S., I mean, there are many isopods here. Most of the isopods people are familiar with in the U.S. did not originate here and were brought here in the past few hundred years, just usually accidentally, and then became established here. So very few of them, fortunately, are problematic. There has been some, they're legally considered a plant pest, or technically considered a plant pest in some cases, and that's why they're regulated. If they weren't considered a plant pest, they wouldn't be regulated at all. So some of them can harm certain agricultural products at certain times. And so that's why they're regulated. And then a lot of them, they just don't know what the impact would be because they're not established here. And then there are, like you say, there's some people are worried about the fact that they are being taken from countries in situations where it might not be sustainable and so on going on as well. So, yeah, it all plays in.
I see. Yeah, I knew that was an issue that we have a lot in the tarantula hobby is species are being collected without the correct documentation and permits and introduced into the hobby and bred and Lasiac comes in to effect with a lot of stuff going on in the U.S. So I didn't know if any of the Lasiac affected isopods in any way like that.
Yeah, I don't know that it's been brought up a lot, but that may become an issue. I think since isopod hobby is still fairly new and a lot of things have just kind of exploded in terms of captive breeding, that probably hasn't been, considered as much as it has been in other things like in tarantula hobby.
Yeah. I mean, the tarantulas really can't. I mean, with the exception of like maybe Florida and some Southwest states, most species can't really establish themselves as an invasive, species in the U.S.
Right.
There was some vagans down in Florida that, not endemic or native to that area at all, but the environment was similar to where they come from. So they were able to kind of get a small population going there just from people releasing them in the wild or them escaping, or, however that happened.
Right.
Now, it brings up something I never even really thought about, the fact that isopods could be invasive and harm agricultural crops or, even like plants out in my garden or something. When you have a bioactive enclosure and you're disposing of that substrate, like what's a safe way of not kind of introducing these isopods into an area?
Okay, great question. And this is something I actually have to address in when I ship on that sheet that I was talking about, the information sheet I have to ship with the order. It talks about this. Basically, you take that substrate, you freeze it for 72 hours, and then you can dispose of it. And that'll basically take care of everything. Any isopod in the substrate would be killed at that point.
Interesting. So you just freeze it. Mm-hmm. I don't know how my wife would feel of me putting used substrate in our freezer for 3 days, but
yeah. My wife has said, we ought to get you your own freezer.
Yeah,
because I'm freezing substrate and I have frozen rodents in there for my snakes and stuff. So
yeah. We got a new refrigerator a few years ago. So the old refrigerator became my refrigerator. I brought it downstairs in the basement. The issue is it's like one of those puke kind of yellowish gold, side by side freezers from the 70s. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason we had to get a new freezer is because that one was going out. Like it just wasn't working very well, holding temperature. And I got about a year's use out of it, and then went to grab some of my frozen mice to thaw to feed the snakes and realized they were already thawed. I was like, uh-oh. So now I have to keep my mice in our upstairs freezer, which she complains about every time she has to make dinner and opens up the freezer and grabs a bag thinking that there might be food in there to see what it is and realize they're a bunch of frozen mice. It's hilarious. So that's something I got to work on is maybe getting a deep freezer or refrigerator or something for the basement down here again. Yeah. Because it was pretty handy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Now there isn't a whole lot, a lot of species, at least, with tarantulas that I think would even really benefit from being kept bioactive. Mainly just because they're so arid. Are there species of isopods or springtails that thrive in like a very arid type of environment?
Well, there are a few desert adapted isopods out there, but generally their solution to that dry environment is microclimate. So they will burrow and be able to conserve moisture that way. So in a setup like a tarantula setup that's very arid and there's no way to get to or create a microclimate of where they could have that humidity that they require, it probably wouldn't do all that well. I do keep, for example, just a few feet from me over here, I have a leopard gecko in a bioactive enclosure with isopods, been thriving for several years now, probably three or 4 years, something like that. And the ventilation is very high. It's just got, the screen top. And so it's not holding a lot of moisture in the air in the enclosure. But the substrate is such that the lower levels of the substrate retain some moisture, and then the top levels are dry because you need, leopard gecko needs to be able to be on dry substrate most of the time, but it needs to be able to burrow down into that extra humidity when it needs it for shedding and different things like that. And so the substrate has been designed specifically to have that gradient. And so the isopods in there, and I keep Porcellonides pruinosus, which is known as the powder blue, the wild type, but there's orange ones and white ones in different colors. And I have several colors in there. So they're all the same species. They do extremely well because they can burrow under the leaf litter and down into the substrate to where they can get that humidity they want. And so they're breeding and doing really well in there. And if you had an arid situation, an arid enclosure, something like that, where there were a microclimate that the isopods could use to regulate what they needed, would probably do fine.
You bring up an interesting topic because I have 2 different leopard gecko enclosures, and probably about like 6-9 months ago, my whole concept of time has been thrown off this past year, so it could be a little bit longer. But I switched them over to bioactive enclosures. Like I've got each one in their own enclosure, similar to what you just described, where the bottom layer is more moist and the top layer is dry. A lot of leaf litter, sphagnum, all stuff like that on top. I introduced springtails and I don't remember what species of isopods though. But it seems to be working out really well. I think that I don't see the isopods very much. Like occasionally, maybe at night, I'll see one or two walking around. So I might want to look into the species you just referred to. You said those were powder blue or powder orange?
Yeah, powder blue, powder orange, and whiteout of the same species are all in there. Yeah.
What I guess my confusion, like, because I'm not like plugged into a lot of the reptile communities, especially like leopard gecko niche kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in a Facebook group and mentioned that I was keeping them bioactive, and they just kicked me out. They're like,
Really?
you can't do that. And I was just like no longer a member of that group.
Wow.
I was like, whoa. So I didn't. Is there controversy there? Is there like, it seemed like a good idea to me.
Yeah.
And from the research I had done, people, were like, yeah, this is great. A great way. And I had talked to a couple other people at like reptile shows that said that it was good because you don't have to clean the enclosure as often.
Right. And I think there is some division in the hobby, definitely about that. Some people are concerned with, for example, loose substrates. And I think that's one of the big, with leopard geckos specifically, and with other herps, but they'll say, oh, loose substrate is bad. Just keep it away. It's awful. You don't want the loose substrate. And if you're keeping your leopard gecko on loose substrate, you have bad husbandry. People will say that. And the thing is,
I think that's what they were telling me, like carpet or paper towels. That's the only way to do it. I'm like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Right. And I had people, because I've posted several videos of this enclosure of my leopard gecko. When I built it, originally put the build together with my daughter, it's her gecko, and we did that and we posted that. And then I've posted updates and, over the past, like I said, 3 or 4 years. And maybe about 6 months ago or so, I had someone post something, said, that substrate is going to kill your gecko. Please change the substrate before it passes. It's going to die. Somebody posted that. And I said, well, thank you for your concern, but the gecko's been in there about 3 years and it's doing just fine, actually. And the substrate is not a sand substrate. It does have loose particles in it, certainly. But there's very little sand in this particular mix. And I think one thing that a lot of leopard gecko keepers will say, and this is a point of controversy, they will say that some will say loose substrates are just bad, and others will say, well, it depends on your husbandry. If you're providing the correct temperature gradients and you're providing the correct humidity and all these things, then if the gecko ingests a little bit of sand, it's going to be okay. And, I take steps to make sure that the gecko is not ingesting a lot of the substrate, because it is a good point that people do point out that leopard geckos don't come from like the Sahara Desert kind of sand. They're in more rocky areas. So they're not going to have a chance to ingest huge amounts of sand. But in my enclosures, they're not going to have a chance to ingest huge amounts of sand either. Now, my enclosure is not set up to replicate their natural environment completely. It is a chance to set up a more of an ecosystem where a lot of the nutrient cycles are being handled in a more natural way, but I'm not trying to necessarily replicate their natural environment to every visible particular. And so I think people get confused over those two things, right? They think, well, if it doesn't look exactly like it's home in the wild, in Pakistan or Afghanistan or something like that, then it's not right. You shouldn't do it. But for me, it's more, is this a way for the gecko to be able to regulate its moisture needs and to be able to thermoregulate and to be able to engage in a lot of natural behaviors like foraging? Well, I got that covered. And maybe that's all I'm going for. And that is what I'm going for. So it works. And I think people confuse those in their heads sometimes. They don't realize they can be separate things.
I would agree. And what something's natural environment is and where it thrives in the wild and how it would thrive in captivity sometimes are completely different.
Exactly.
You see that with a lot of people get mixed up in like the tarantula hobby because a species comes from, a tropical area of South America. So in their mind, they're like, I have to replicate a rainforest environment. And then they end up killing the tarantula because it's way too humid and way too warm. And it's like, it comes from an area that has an average temperature of 85 degrees and an average, 75% humidity, but they escape that. Like they burrow or they go up in trees and, I don't know, they've adapted to live in that environment, but in a small kind of microclimate of an enclosure, you're making it a lot more difficult for them, to kind of get you. So I noticed that with, like, I adopted a well, I bought one leopard gecko for my son. And then I went to buy, like, one of the ways I afford all the enclosures behind me is I buy them secondhand, like off Craigslist and places like that. So I find somebody that's like selling $100 Exoterra enclosure for like 10 or $20 just to get it out of their garage. And I scoop those up all the time. And I went to pick one up, and they didn't mention this in the ad or even when I talked to them on the phone, but I show up and they're like, do you want to take the leopard gecko that's in there as well? And I'm like, well, no. And they're like, well, I mean, if you don't want it, that's fine. We'll just let it go out back. And I'm like, I'll take it. Like, I'm not going to just like let you feed it to the neighborhood cats.
Yeah.
And the poor, it was almost a full grown leopard gecko that was kept in this like 12 by 12 by 12 exoteric cube, So it was not, and I didn't know a whole lot about leopard geckos, but I knew just from looking, like, that's not a good setup for that. It didn't have enough room. They had like this really powerful heat lamp on it. So I brought it home, and it had been struggling with its shed, like especially around its toes. Like it just wasn't shedding completely. And I was trying to find different, methods that people have used to kind of facilitate a healthy shed, and, soaking it and all this kind of stuff. And that poor gecko did not want to be handled at all. Like, it just was not cool with me. I was struggling with trying to get it to just kind of soak. And I saw somewhere that someone suggested like bioactives were very helpful in that situation because they could, like you mentioned, burrow to a level where the moisture was beneficial for them. And I figured I'll try it out. So I just tried it out with just that one. And I left my other, on like that typical kind of reptile carpet that you buy at the pet store. I think that's what I was using for the one I got, from a pet store. And I noticed that the one I had put in the bioactive all of a sudden seemed to just have a lot more energy.
Yeah.
Like, it was wandering around its enclosure a lot more. It seemed a lot more engaged and interested in its environment and was like thriving, started putting on weight, and was, had a couple of good sheds. And I was like, well, if this has been that beneficial to this one, I think I'm going to set up the other one in a similar enclosure. Which like I said, they're both like that now. They seem to really be enjoying it. That's why I was surprised. But I think the biggest complaint that I was getting back is like, you're going to cause impaction in your gecko. And so far I haven't had any issues. And it's reassuring to hear that you've been doing this for years and haven't had any issues with impaction.
Right. Yeah. It has not been an issue at all. And like I said, I do take some steps to make sure the gecko's not ingesting a lot of substrate. Almost all the feeding we do for this gecko is either by hand or in a food dish. So it's not doing a lot of hunting by itself in the enclosure where it's going to eat bits of leaves or whatever. But I think, I think a lot of it has to do with if you have an otherwise healthy gecko, the ingestion of a little bit of particulate substrate is not that big of a deal. If you have a sick gecko, on the other hand, that can really, throw it off even more. So, yeah. And I've noticed the same thing with the sheds and with the activity levels that you mentioned. Once we put our gecko, we had it in a, when it was a hatchling, we got it, not exactly a hatchling, but a young juvenile, we got it and kept it in a 10-gallon tank when it was small with the paper towels and, just the normal setup for a while until it got older. And when we moved it to this larger and more interesting enclosure, basically, it was so much more active. It had some problems with the sheds, a little bit on its toes, not a huge issue, but a little bit. And as soon as we moved it into the enclosure, it was much better. Like you say, it's the microclimate, just like with the tarantulas in the rainforest. If you allow the animal a chance to choose its microclimate from moment to moment, whatever it needs, it makes a huge difference.
Now, for your gecko, do you use like Undertank heaters, lights, that deep heat? I can't remember what it's called now.
Oh yeah, the deep heat emitter. I haven't used that particular one. What I have for ours set up, and this was based on the BioDude's recommendation with the kit that we bought for the Bioactive kit, and I've since bought other Bioactive kit materials from him because I liked how this one worked out. We put an undertank heater on the side of the tank, and then put a cork bark hide right up against it so that the gecko can access the warm glass. The way the cork bark is shaped, the gecko can right up against the warmed glass and warm up. Mm-hmm. But when the BioDude explains how he does it, he says if you put an undertank heater under this substrate and water happens to pool on it, it's probably going to crack it. So This way it can't crack it. It's on the side there. And then we also we have LED light and UVB light up above. So not a basking lamp per se, like a heat lamp, but it does have a UVB light. And we've noticed that she loves the UVB light. She'll go sit in there, and her color, even though leopard geckos don't need it, you can raise generations of healthy leopard geckos without UVB. Her color looks better.
Interesting.
She just looks like a more vibrant gecko. You know how they generally look right after they shed, and oh wow, that looks nice. She looks more like that now all the time.
What kind of UVB light is it? Like a compact fluorescent?
It's a compact fluorescent, and the tank's not high, and the substrate is fairly deep, and so she can get up, pretty close to it.
It sounds like the exact same setup I have. I also got the BioDude's Leopard Gecko. I have the heat pad on the side, but I don't have a UVB light. Because I like you mentioned, I was under the impression they didn't need it because they usually come out like at dusk and through the evening and stuff. And so I never even considered getting that, but I might have to try that out. That would be interesting.
Well, some of the research that's been done with reptiles lately, with crested geckos, with leopard geckos, and some others too, is that even nocturnal lizards and so on will, for example, stick their nose out of their burrow during the morning and during the evening, and before they go out to hunt in the evening, for example, or before they're about to go to bed in the morning, and just soak up a few rays. When they are apparently, leopard geckos specifically, they've done some research, are very efficient at picking up rays in the evening and in the morning. Like they're optimized for picking up those UVB rays and utilizing them to their fullest. So that's what she'll do. She'll sit out under the UVB, like with just her head sticking out of her burrow, but she's right by the light, she's picking it up. So that seems to be a thing that seems to help. And with crested geckos too, they're asleep during the day, but they're usually asleep where at least part of their body is exposed to the sun. So they're getting it too. So they may not need it per se, but it could very well be beneficial. I've even given it to my morning geckos before. I've done it both with and without, and their color looks more rich when I give it to them.
Yeah. Do you keep any day geckos?
I don't have any day geckos. That has been something on my list. I want to do day geckos sometime, but I don't have any.
Yeah, I have one. I also have it in a BioDude's I used his stuff to set up its enclosure, and it seems to be thriving. In fact, it laid an egg.
Oh, awesome!
Yesterday, I was like, you haven't seen. I mean, it's been a couple of years.
Really?
I know you haven't been around any males. I don't know why you're producing an egg, but
cool.
It was interesting. But she's. I think initially when I got her, she was small. So I had her in a Exoterra, like 12 by 12 by 18 type. So I had bought the bioactive setup for that. She's grown. And I was like, she just seemed cramped in there. Like I just didn't have enough. I didn't even realize, somebody pointed it out in one of my videos. Like, you might want to put that in a bigger enclosure because she'll be more active. So I set her up in I think it's like a 20-gallon kind of tall breeder. And she's, seems to be thriving in that, running around, and it still has her little hiding places. But I just essentially moved that bioactive enclosure into a larger one, and it seemed to be doing really well. Now I was wondering if you keep any snakes at all, like what species, or is that something that you have in your collection?
Yeah, I do. And snakes are kind of a new thing for me. We started out with a corn snake a few years ago. I think it's been, it's either been 2 or 3 years. I'm not sure which one now. But probably 2 years. We got a corn snake that was someone was keeping it, couldn't keep it anymore. And we adopted it, and it turned out they weren't feeding it very much. And so it was a little bit stunted, but we helped it put on a lot of size. So it went from about 50 grams to over 500 grams. And we really enjoyed keeping the corn snake. And I just thought, well, I've always loved snakes. I mean, when I was 6, that was like my favorite thing to do, is to go find snakes. And I've never really stopped loving snakes. I just hadn't kept any. So I thought, well, I need to do more snakes. And so I ended up getting, a little over a year ago, I got 3 red-sided garter snakes. So this is a Montana.
I saw your video on that.
Oh yeah, I love them. Yeah. They're a locality from Montana where this particular subspecies, some of them have kind of the reddish coloration, some don't, but this particular locality does have it. And raised them from just little tiny, neonates to adults now, where this spring, around June or so, I'll probably get some babies. And it's been really fun having them in a bioactive setup. I did get another BioDude setup. They're in a 40-gallon breeder together. They're 2 males and a female. And it works really well. I have clown isopods in there. I thought, I want to see if these will work as a bioactive cleanup crew in this setup, because I know the snakes aren't going to eat them. They're a little bit more on the expensive side as far as isopods go. But since the snakes aren't going to bother the isopods, I'll try it out. And it's working well. They're in there with several species of fern and a couple other plants, and they do a great job cleaning up the sheds. I occasionally will take sheds out, but I don't need to because they disappear so fast. They're good at getting the snake feces out of there, doing really well.
Yeah, I really enjoy bioactives, not just because it makes cleaning a lot easier, but there's just something about, I just enjoy looking at them, like seeing that it's like this living environment. It's not just some substrate and a plastic hide like
right.
Sometimes you end up with.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are drawn to that aspect of there's this kind of ecosystem going on, and it may not be, like we were saying before, not exactly what they're going to encounter in the wild, but there's a natural cycle going on there, and it's beautiful to see the cycle and see the variety in there, and look and see, oh, it's not just these snakes in here, and it's the snakes, like you say. With your leopard gecko, I noticed, when I initially got these snakes and they were very small, I didn't put them in a bioactive because, they'd slip right out. They're so tiny. When garter snakes are like tiny when they're babies. And so I had them in a plastic bin, but their behavior is so different when they're in a bioactive enclosure. Just watching them go and bask, because they had an undertank heater before, and they of course go from the warm side to the cool side, but now they have a UVB light and a basking light over like a built up area with cork bark on the top, and they hang out there, and they'll go there in the morning to bask, and they'll just dart around. Like yesterday they were engaging in some mating activity and just zipping around the whole enclosure, and just seeing them be so active and interested in life is fantastic. And how they'll interact with you when they're in an enclosure like that is fantastic too, because in a tub they're not seeing you as much if they're on a rack in a tub, that kind of thing. You can keep garters in a rack, you can keep them, that's fine, it works. But in something like this, they see you walk around the room, and they pay attention to you. And when I open the enclosure, I can just like wiggle my fingers a little bit, and they're like, oh, what do you do? And they'll come right out of the enclosure right onto me and just basically jump into my hands, and it's great.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. I initially, my wife picked up a ball python from a reptile expo a while back, and I had never really had any interest in keeping snakes. That's kind of her thing. But because they're down here in the basement with all the tarantulas, it usually kind of becomes my responsibility to feed them and maintain them while I'm doing everything else down here. And initially we had the ball python kind of set up, like a basic care sheet says, aspen bedding and it was very reclusive. I mean, part of that was because it had just got moved, across the country and put in a new enclosure. But even after it had time to kind of settle in, I was kind of disappointed in how maybe like inactive, or it just wasn't an exciting snake to really watch. It just kind of seemed to spend most of its time hiding out. And it had one bad shed. Like it wasn't even a bad shed. It just when it shed, it didn't get all of it off its face. And, it got some stuck shed, and we were having to, soak it and kind of, get all that taken care of. And and I had already tried this with the geckos. So I was like, well, if it worked for the leopard geckos, maybe a bioactive would be beneficial for this guy, since apparently I'm not providing it with enough humidity to have a good shed. So I set it up with a bioactive. Again, I use the BioDude's kind of the little pre-made kit, and it's become a much more sociable animal. Like, I think part of it is because it has so much more places to hide. There's plants growing all over, so it can it feels more protected when it's out and about. But I seem to see it out, more often than not. Like I'll come downstairs and it'll be like all wrapped up around some plants and cork bark at the top of its enclosure, just kind of hanging out and slithering around, and it's become a lot more enjoyable snake to keep now that it's in this bioactive. It hasn't had any issue shedding since I've done that. And in, like you mentioned, like I've noticed I'll be, because it's literally like right, you can't see it, but it's like literally right behind me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure, well, of course, I talk about it and that's not going to be the case. I was going to say it's probably watching me, but a lot of times I'll be here like editing videos or, working on my computer and it's just like, it's coming out of its hide, just staring at me. Like, what's that guy doing? Did he bring me any mice? It's a very cool snake.
Yeah, and giving a snake like that the opportunity, the enrichment of having an enclosure that's just more varied than some aspen bedding and a couple of hides is just, it's incredible what they do with that, to just kind of take it and run with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So on your YouTube channel, you're talking about isopods and inverts and reptiles. I mean, like, what's the goal of your YouTube channel? Like, what kind of what is it you're trying to do?
Well, I think there's several things going on there. One is I have always been someone who's been interested in more than one type of animal. Some people say, okay, for me, it's boa constrictors, and that's their thing, and that's all they do, and they become really good at that, and that's fine. That's totally cool. And other people pick, something else, and it's very specific. For me, it's always been a little more general, and I feel like part of my mission is to say, well, I'm enjoying all these different things, and I want you to enjoy them too, and I want you to learn from what I have learned and what I continue to learn about anything you can put in a glass box and call it a pet, basically. Whether it's a reptile, it's a fish, it's an amphibian, it's an invert, whatever it is. I want you to be able to do the same kind of thing that I do, and I want you to be able to enjoy it and have that information that you need to be able to do it well. Learn from the experiences of others, mine and others, who have, figured out what works and what doesn't.
I see. Now, on your website, do you sell like all the types of pets that you keep, or is there like a specific species that you kind of retail?
Well, I focus on my website mostly on isopods, but I do sell other things as well. For example, those of you who keep tropical fish, for example, know the Daphnia and scuds or amphipods, which are, again, crustaceans like isopods, but they're an excellent live food for fish and axolotls and things like that. So I breed those, and I breed kind of a lot of them, and I sell them. So they're on my website, and a lot of people buy those, and I sell food for those as well, things like that. Other live food cultures, that's always kind of been a thing. When I was 13 years old, I was culturing Daphnia and mealworms and various types of foods for fish and reptiles, and I've always done that. And so my website has access to those. Any of those that I raise and sell and ship, I will put up there. And, my morning geckos, it's a colony that's, because you can't really stop morning geckos from producing if you're doing it right. They're going to be producing. So I usually have some of those for sale too. But it's generally the isopods. I've got probably close to 40 different types of isopods now that I sell. No, I don't sell them all. I keep about 40 different types. I don't sell them all because, some of them I can't ship. Although I will sell some locally, because if it doesn't go across state lines, I'm pretty safe with the permit. So some of those I sell locally, but if it's anything that's shipping, it's from a very specific list. So my website has the ones I can ship on it. But people come to my house locally because I'll post on we have like a local version of Craigslist here. I think most places do, but we have one like that that's just for our state and like the surrounding area. And I'll post isopods and other things on there too, and people will come by and pick them up.
I gotcha. Now, can they buy them directly from your website, or do you just have the list on your website and they contact you to see what's available?
Basically,
how does that work?
Yeah, I don't have the website set up as with like shopping carts or anything yet, and I think I need to because business is kind of growing. But what I have now is I have my stock and price list up, and then I have a link where they can message me through the website, and then just say, I want this, and then I send them a payment link, and then I ship it.
I see. Now, when it comes to shipping isopods,
mm-hmm.
I know like with scorpions and tarantulas and any venomous species,
mm-hmm.
it needs to be shipped. I mean, legally, it should be shipped, and for the safety of the animal through like FedEx
mm-hmm.
overnight.
Mm-hmm.
But isopods seem to be, I mean, obviously they're not venomous, and they seem to be a lot more what's the word?
M-
like,
More
uh,
forgiving, maybe.
yeah, yeah. Can you ship those through the post service, like USPS?
You can, yeah. And there are certain regulations that relate to that as well. But you can do it very successfully. I generally want them, overnight's always the best, but I think a lot of times with isopods, it's not necessary if the weather is okay. And I do ship with cold packs and heat packs and everything when necessary, the right kinds of things. Provide some insulation in the shipping container, that kind of thing. And I've had really, really good results with that. Of course, there once in a while, usually the post office is fine and they arrive just fine and everything's cool. But you have the horror stories that occasionally occur, rare instances. I had one recently where the package was delayed. It was supposed to arrive in 2 days, and it took 9.
Oh, wow.
To get there. And I was a little concerned about it, but when it arrived, everything was fine. Nice. Wasn't a single problem. The way that I ship the isopods and just how isopods are in general, you make sure that the isopods are going to get some air, but they're not going to desiccate. And as a requirement, when I applied for my permit, you're supposed to specify how you're going to ship them. And so I specified specifically, because I had a lot of success with this, I'm shipping them on damp paper towels, and they're going to be in a ventilated deli cup. And, I explained those things. So that's how I'm required to ship them, because that's how my permit is put together. And other people may have different requirements on their permit depending on how they applied. But that's what I use. And it works great because I put enough paper towel in there that it will retain moisture for a long time. And it does just fine. And I remember ordering some isopods a couple of years ago, and it was in December, and it gets cold where I live, really cold. And the heat pack, when I opened up the box, the heat pack was, cold. It had long since expired and everything, but I opened it up and the isopods were doing fine. I didn't have a single casualty from shipping in December and getting lost for a week, this particular package. And most isopods can handle pretty cool temperatures. Not all. Some of the tropical isopods, like one thing you can do if you have dwarf white isopods, because they're parthenogenic, you get one in an enclosure or in an isopod enclosure, for example. If even one gets in there, you might not notice, but after a few months, there'll be more and more and more, and pretty soon they can overtake and actually wipe out your other cultures because they'll outcompete them. People often ask me, can you keep isopods together, a different species? Well, usually it's not a good idea because that kind of thing happens. One species will outcompete another species. So anyway, as I was saying, one way to get rid of dwarf whites is if you have an enclosure that's been infested with them and you're keeping the other species, you put it in the refrigerator overnight, you take it out, the dwarf whites will be dead and the other isopods will be fine. Because most of them can handle cooler temperatures, but the tropical ones can't do it. Yeah, which makes sense.
So are all species, are all isopods parthenogenic?
No.
Or is it just okay.
There are a few species that are just parthenogenic as far as we know. There are some species that may be parthenogenic sometimes, kind of like crested geckos. And there are a lot of species that just seem to reproduce with males and females, as we would expect from a lot of other organisms.
Just shows my lack of knowledge on isopods. I never even thought about the fact they could be parthenogenic.
Yeah, the dwarf whites are, and the species called the dwarf striped, those two are definitely parthenogenic. And there are probably some others out there as well. Some genetic studies that have been done with some initial studies have shown that there may be some that are partially parthenogenic. It can be in certain situations.
Now, a lot of the people that listen to the podcast, pretty much just keep tarantulas, or tarantulas and scorpions and stuff like that.
Right.
And I think one of the draws towards keeping isopods is, we were talking about shipping earlier, is the fact that you don't have to pay for that overnight shipping exclusively, because sometimes that can be cost prohibitive.
Right.
$55 for a $20 tarantula. It sometimes can really raise the price, and it seems like it's kind of attractive, or at least makes them a little bit more attractive. So if somebody's listening and they've never kept isopods, they're a beginner, they're looking for something maybe that you have available that you sell, what would be a good beginner species that's colorful and interesting?
Okay.
What would you suggest?
Well, I have a couple, and I recently did a video on this too, but I'd be happy to kind of address this right now as well. If you want something just as a pet, you want to just keep it because it's interesting and colorful. One that's great is the zebra pillbug, Armadilly Immaculatum, and their name kind of makes sense. They have basically zebra stripes. They're pretty easy to take care of. They've got this striking pattern that I just don't get tired of. I probably have well over 1,000 zebra isopods. I'm selling them too, so that makes a difference. But I have like one 28-quart bin with just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and then I have another smaller bin that's got a lot of them, probably hundreds in that one too. They just appeal to me partly because they're active a lot during the day. You can see them running around, and I think that's a big thing with a pet. I mean, some of you tarantula keepers especially are familiar with the concept of pet holes, that there are certain species you just don't see unless they're eating or something. And this some isopods are like that, but zebra pillbugs are not. They tend to be quite active and out about. Now, when you first set up an enclosure for them and you just have 12 in this 6-quart bin or something, you're not going to see them that much. But as they breed and so on, you'll see more of them. So that's a great one. Another one that I like a lot is the dairy cow. And it's called the dairy cow because it's basically got a white body with random black patches on it, or dark gray patches or whatever. So it looks kind of like, that pattern we're familiar with on some cows. They are really, really day active species. They tend to just roam around the enclosure all the time. They get really pretty big. So if you're used to just the normal isopods that you see in enclosure, I mean, they're much larger than a dwarf white, but they're much larger than the isopods you see in your backyard too. And very, very active. They're very voracious feeders. And they don't seem to be bothered over much by light. So you can open up the enclosure, drop in a piece of food, and watch them swarm it, just like cartoon termites. They just munch it until it's gone, and it's really kind of fun to watch them do that. So that's another species that I think is great for beginners. And then the powder blues that I mentioned are another one because they come in lots of different colors. There's one called the Oreo Crumble, which is kind of similar color to the dairy cow. It's like a dark gray or black with white random patches on it. And then they've got the orange ones and the white ones and the gray ones. And you can actually put them all together and let them all breed, and you'll get all different colors. And they are very fast movers, fast breeders, and again, active in the daytime. Really fun to watch. I went to a bug zoo recently, an insectarium, where they had this really cool enclosure. It was like an LED light above this enclosure with all these flowering plants growing in it. And it was an enclosure for bumblebees. So there was a colony of bumblebees that were coming in and pollinating these flowers and gathering nectar and pollen. And then underneath it had the bumblebee hive that you could see through red windows so that it wasn't bothering the bees. But on the surface of the terrarium, on the substrate, there were all these powder orange isopods running around in this really super bright light. They weren't bothered by it. And they were just running around, cleaning up the dead leaves and the bits of the dead bees that were in there and different things. And so that's a great species because they're really, really active and easy to see. So those are very cool. Those are a few. And then, of course, there's one more is the Armadilly vulgare, the common pillbug. I mean, people can go out in their backyard and collect them. There's that. But there are so many different color varieties these days. I mean, you can get them white ones with black spots and gold spots. You can get orange ones. You can get ones there's one called the gem mix where it's just they put all the different morphs together, and so you look in there and it's like jelly beans. You like pick your flavor. You got all different things going in there. So they're super easy to take care of, and they're super colorful. So they're great for someone who wants a lot of variety. You could do something like that.
We're gonna have to talk after the podcast because I think I'm gonna have to order some of those powder blue or different colors. Of those isopods from you because I think that would be very cool to put in my gecko enclosure.
Oh yeah.
So your channel, you upload once a week. What do you do? Is it a specific day every week?
Yeah. I do actually twice a week now. I started out doing it once a week when I became more serious about it. But I do a live stream on Tuesdays, and the live stream's typically about an hour. And that's sometimes it's very thematic. Sometimes I have a guest, like when I had you on, and I've been trying to do a guest at least once a month now, because I think that's a lot of fun and helps grow the community, and so on. And I can draw on expertise like yours. Like I've never kept tarantulas because my wife won't let me. You could help, fill in that gap and provide expertise on my channel. So I do that. And then on Friday afternoons, I release a video that's not a live stream typically. Once in a while it is, but usually it's something that I've prepared ahead of time, like a care guide or something like that, like you were talking about.
So I highly suggest everybody go check out his channel. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of those uploads. I find it very helpful. I even now, even though I've rewatched a couple of your videos, because I'm like, let me make sure I'm doing that right. And I really enjoy the way that you put the information out there and kind of like break it down in a very easy to understand, relatable way. Like I think that's what I enjoy the most about it. It's like we're having a conversation right now. That's what it feels like your videos are. Like you're just talking to somebody and answering questions that maybe they didn't even know they had regarding that. So
cool.
Major props to you, man. I really appreciate your content.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much. I really enjoy yours too. I just listened to your Exotic Pet Collective video or podcast with Tarantula Cribs, and that was awesome. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's quite the couple. They're very interesting people. I enjoy talking to them and getting to know them. There's just so many just different aspects of the invertebrate hobby, and exotic pets in general. Like I spend so much time focused just on tarantulas. Like you mentioned, we all kind of find our little niche. And then for a long time, I kept other species, of reptiles and inverts, but for whatever reason, I found my passion in tarantulas. And that's why I was like, well, that's why I named everything the Tarantula Collective at first, because that's what it was going to be about.
Mm-hmm.
But as life kind of unfolds, passion shifts slightly, and kind of started getting into scorpions a lot. Found a lot of correlations between what I liked about tarantulas. I also, could find that in scorpions and other arachnids, true spiders, and like I got a vengaroon and a tailless whip scorpion, and now there's isopods and millipedes, and it's like, it's kind of growing. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do a podcast, I don't want to like just be about tarantulas, because there's so many interesting people like you and bugs in cyberspace and a lot of other people I wanted to kind of talk to, because it seems like a lot of people that just like very few people just keep tarantulas. Like they start out, well, I'll just have some tarantulas, and before they know it, they've got scorpions or isopods. Or do you do anything with millipedes? Do you keep millipedes?
Yeah, I keep and breed several species right now. I've got maybe 4 or 5 different species of millipedes.
Interesting. I picked some up at an expo, and they told me when I got them that I couldn't keep the millipedes and the isopods in the same enclosure because the isopods would eat the millipedes' eggs or something like that. Is that something you can confirm, or can you keep them together in a bioactive enclosure?
Well, I've seen people succeed at it, and I've heard horror stories about it. So I think it's one of those things where it has a lot to do with the species you're putting together, the particular environment they're in. I have heard, I think it was, Oren McMonigal, who writes a lot about millipedes and isopods and so on. He said that if a millipede's egg case, because they'll often build kind of a substrate case around their eggs, not all species will do it, some will, that if that cracks open, the isopods will go after the eggs. And when millipedes molt, they may not attack a millipede that is molting, but if there's any kind of problem when the millipede is molting, a lot of times if the millipede is undisturbed, they'll come out like a little bit of an imperfect molt, but then they can correct it in future molts. But if that molt if they're damaged enough during that process that there's hemolymph that the isopods can smell, they'll go after it and attack it. So I think Peter at Bugs in Cyberspace said basically, you can keep them together, but if you're interested in breeding either one of them, it's probably not the best way to do it. And I think that's a really balanced way to say it.
Well, I know we're running short on time, and I'm really glad that you were able to come on the podcast and talk and have some very interesting insights. Is there anything that you want, like you got anything exciting that's coming available for sale soon, or any fun videos that you wanted to talk about?
Well, let's see. I just really recently got a bunch of different morphs of isopods that I hadn't had before. So in a couple of months. I've only had them about a month, so they're just starting to breed now. But in a couple of months, I'll have a lot more that I can add to my list, my stock list, as soon as they're really producing. So I'm excited for that. And I'm working on more collaborations like the one we're doing right now, which has been awesome. I'm glad that I was able to come on. I'm going to be doing more of those on my channel. So keep your eyes peeled for that. More collaborations are coming.
Are there any names you want to drop? We could keep an eye out for?
Well, let's see. Well, I probably ought to wait till things are a little more concretized, but
I understand.
I think a lot of people will be pretty excited, I think.
Very cool. Very cool, man. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of your YouTube videos. I find them very helpful. Check out his website, aquarimax.com, and you're on Instagram as well, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Do you do any other social media? You on like TikTok or anything like that?
TikTok, not yet, although my daughter says I should be. But basically, I would say YouTube's the biggest one. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Instagram's probably the second, and then I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, and then I've got my website. I think those are pretty much it. But YouTube is the biggest one. But if you want to contact me, you can either use the contact page on my website, or you can use Instagram to message me, because I get so many comments that I really try my best to answer as many as I can. But yeah, it's hard to answer them all.
It is. And just the way YouTube works, sometimes comments almost get hidden, like they get buried. Yeah. And it's like, I'll think I've answered all the comments, or at the very least, like them or something. And then I'll refresh the list a couple months later and realize there's comments from 6 months ago that I never saw. And I'm like, well, how did that get hidden? Like, I was for sure I looked at all of them.
Exactly. I see that too.
TikTok is a bittersweet social media platform. Sometimes I loathe the fact that I ever started a TikTok account.
Really?
But sometimes it's a lot of fun. It's like a whole nother realm of people that, maybe don't watch YouTube or aren't on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
You can connect with people that normally you wouldn't have access to. So that part I like.
That's true.
Sometimes it's mainly people that are like 14 years old, though. So it's, it's good if you're like trying to help kind of generate a new generation of keepers. And that's not exclusive. There's a lot of people our age that are on TikTok as well nowadays, but yeah. It's interesting.
I may have to check that out.
Yeah. One thing that is beneficial when it comes to TikTok is that you really don't even need to create new content. Like a lot of times I just take my YouTube video and chop it up into like 20-second segments and then just upload that to TikTok.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point.
Yeah. So it's not a whole lot of extra work, but yeah, you just do that and have a presence on there. Get some fresh blood into the hobby.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's awesome. And I hope that, there's so many things I wanted to talk about that we didn't even have a chance to discuss. And I'm hoping that you'll be willing to come back on again in the future.
Oh, yes. I'd be delighted.
That would be awesome. Yeah, there's still a lot more stuff I want to pick your brain about.
Cool. Yeah, I'm up for it anytime.
All right, man. Well, thanks again. And thanks to everybody that's listening or watching. You can check out Aquarimax on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Definitely follow him, give him likes, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can catch the Exotic Pet Collective. I'm uploading every Thursday on pretty much any platform that you can find your podcasts on. We're on Google, Apple, all that. And then I upload the video version sometime later on in the day on YouTube. So thank you all for listening and watching. And I guess we'll just talk next week. All right, y'all have a nice day. We'll see ya. All right. Awesome, man. That was very good.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was fun to talk to you last time, fun to talk to you this time. And it seems like really organic. Like it's easy to we could keep talking like you're saying. It would be super easy.